Good afternoon, good evening. Oh, hi, but yeah, welcome to my talk, School of GitHub Actions. It's been an action-packed day, so I appreciate you guys all attending me. I'm Jonathan Ruckwood. I'm a lead consultant at Open Credo. We're a consultancy specializing in cloud-native platform engineering and data engineering. And I just wanted to take some time today to just share my experiences with the GitHub Action service or product. But before I get into that, I just wanted to tell you a bit about the inspiration of this talk, and it's really based around this YouTuber called Ogmios, and is a school of Zen motoring. He's a self-styled Zen driver and battle rapper. He basically just drives around London with a dash cam, commentating on things in a soothing way. And the main thing I take from this is it's easy to get het up when driving around London, letting the small things bother you. And you get wound up, and before you know it, you're making careless mistakes because things outside your control are just affecting you. And it really spoke to me. And I think those principles can be applied here because when you use GitHub Actions, they couldn't be further from that. So I find GitHub Actions fairly frustrating, unpredictable, unforgiving. Things don't work as expected. There's subtleties in the documentation, and you don't really appreciate it until you're in the middle of the change and you're like, oh, so that's why they said that. And also, you're at the whim of the outer dev loop, so there's longer cycle time and feedback. You push something, you see it doesn't work, and you continue until you can fix it. So it really felt so apt to apply Zen-like thinking here. Sometimes you just need to let things wash over you like a wave coming on the horizon, but come to terms with it and accept that it's just going to hit you. But I'm really not doing down GitHub Actions here. It's a familiar experience with continuous integration tooling in general. All tools suffer from this problem, this long feedback cycle when you're dealing with problems. So despite this, should you use it? Well, I would argue definitely. If you're already using GitHub, it integrates well with PRs, releases, all the lifecycle, and the other elements of the GitHub ecosystem. Also, it's just there. Plus, if you're a smaller team, GitHub does the heavy lifting for you. You don't have to focus on running it, managing it, patching it. And also, if you're a startup or something, it's one less thing you need to bootstrap if you just want to get going. You can just focus on business features. There's also really good discoverability of things like actions in the marketplace, great documentation, and there's there's a lot of use cases out there. So I would say, or I would argue, if you're using GitHub, it should be your go-to solution until it no longer works for you. It's a great starting point. I think it's a really great tool, and I want this to be accessible, so I'm just going to run through some of the fundamentals quite quickly, and I appreciate some of you have already got experience with GitHub Actions. So I wanted to build a Maven project. What would the pipeline look like? Maybe something like this. You check out your source code, you set up Java, you do the actual Maven build, and then depending on whether that build passes or not, you might upload some results and produce an artifact. In terms of workflow, what does that really look like? Well, it's a YAML file that you declare. Well, it's declarative, defining YAML. It's in your repository and sits alongside your source code. You have some events which trigger the workflow at the top, so on response to commit being pushed to main. And then you have these jobs. These jobs are run independently. They're like a unit of work. Within that, so they run in parallel, like a unit of work. And then within that, you have the steps, and these are the actual, it's the actual workhorse of the workflow. So these are run sequentially, and as you can see here, we're doing a checkout, setting up Java, running an actual bash or scripting command like Maven package, and then we have that optional step at the end, which is uploading those surefire test results. And then if you've not seen GitHub Actions before, this is what it looks on the UI. So this is the workflow. You can see the build job on the left, and in the detail view, build also, digging into that, the summary of the build job. So this is those steps that you saw defined in the YAML. And then just to prove it's actually there, here's some Maven that's run. And, who doesn't love some Maven output? So great. So that's what workflows and actions looks like. And I just wanted to move on to now just talk about some of the tips that I've learned over using this product over the past year. So I'd say one of the first things you should definitely consider doing, and it's something that's gotten easier over the past 18 months, is caching. And when we talk about caching here, we're talking about maybe build artifacts or things that are being fetched from external sources and primarily files. And I'm all for avoiding premature optimization, but caching is just something that's become really easy with GitHub Actions. And it's definitely worth doing because every time you're running your jobs, they're running on these kind of clean environments. They're ephemeral. So anything you're fetching, like dependencies or things that your build needs, it's got to do a round trip out to the internet or somewhere to go and grab that for you. So by caching this stuff, you save time and you save compute, so you save money as well. And it also, there's less time you waiting around. So each repository has access up to a cache space of 10 gigabytes. And when that gets full, the oldest entries get evicted first, but then if there are unused entries in that cache, they get automatically pruned and evicted as well. Now, a lot of actions now support the cache directly, but previously you'd use this actions cache action, a lot of actions. But it's still there basically if you have more nuanced or like specific use cases that you want to use this cache with. But as I've said, it's something that's there, it's free or included, and you can use it. So the two main places I would say you should consider using it is with dependencies. And here we're using the setup Java action, and we're specifying, because it's a Maven project, that we use the Maven cache. And all this does is it takes a hash of your POM file, the contents of your POM file, to generate a cache key. And then it will store the contents of your M2 repository as a value in the cache. So then what happens if your POM file changes, you get a new cache key, or the new cache key is generated. So it'll be a cache miss, and you'll get downloaded. The dependencies will be downloaded again. But mostly when your project solidifies and the dependencies become quite stable, it will be fetching the jars from the cache, so you avoid that round trip to Maven Central or all the other places you're fetching jars from. And that really, even for even if the jars are not that big, there's a lot of them, so that really does eat up some time. The other main uses with caching is with Docker. So here I'm using the build push action. And what you can do is you can specify to use the cache from the GitHub Actions cache, and now this action supports that. Also, there I've specified that we use the max mode, so this is exporting like all layers of the cache and any kind of intermediate, all layers of the image and any intermediate steps to the cache. All this means that if you're building an image in like a layered way, so instead of having like one Uber jar, it's actually split into across several layers. Then you may only be, when you're building an image each time, you may only be changing the layer with the source code in. Everything else can be retrieved from cache, and that saves a ton of time. So I would say that both of these things are simple to enable and to get started with, but it's also worth profiling it just to see if you do see an improvement. Depending on how you're building your Docker images or your dependencies, it actually may adversely affect it, but I guess all I'm saying is just try it out. So another thing I wanted to talk about was workflow limits. Time is money, basically. So if you know areas, basically you just want to minimize the execution of a step or a job for a reasonable amount. For example, if there's a problem with GitHub Actions itself, or maybe a test would overrun, it's just sensible to put some limits in place using this timeout minutes. Otherwise, they'd run for, I think default is 360 minutes. And particularly when we've seen problems with the GitHub Action service, it's better if your workflow's failed earlier for faster feedback, just to know something is going wrong. Or even if a test is running haywire, then again, you get that early feedback that something's wrong. Another thing I wanted to talk about was the concurrency. So you can either use a fixed key or a dynamic key, and the main consequence of this is if it's a fixed key, then you're saying only one instance of this workflow can run at a time. But with a key with an expression in, you're saying, well, you can have more instances. So if we use a GitHub ref, if we're responding to a pull request event, then it just means we can ensure that there is a single build or a single workflow invocation per pull request, which is quite useful. And if you combine that with a cancel in progress, then it means that when new commits are pushed, then any existing workflow invocations will get cancelled and a new one will start. So you're always building the freshest. So it's worth thinking about this stuff because I've seen situations where you can have race conditions, particularly if you're building images and you're doing things like tagging the latest. For example, if several PRs are merged into the default branch quite close together, then sometimes you're not really sure what Docker image got that latest tag, which can be a bit of a problem. And especially then if you're rolling those images out to a development environment continuously, then yeah, it can take a little bit of time trying to work out what's in that dev environment. So you can just minimize some pain there. I just wanted to briefly talk about the reuse and composability. So there's a few different ways that you can kind of share stuff in GitHub Actions. You can use a local action, so that's an action defined inside your repository that allows you to then share that between workflows in that repository. So an action could be, and this comes into composite actions, it could be like a common utility like to dispatch a workflow event, or it may just be as a composite action, like a sequence of steps that you want to reuse. And then, of course, you can publish your own actions publicly and within an organization and keep them private to an organization. You also have the ability to reuse workflows. So if you have a centralized way of building like a Spring Boot service and you want it to do like container scanning, linting, all these different various bits to kind of adhere to company standards, you can have a centralized workflow which you then just call out to from a workflow in your like service repository or your code repository. So there's at different levels, there's ways of sharing this stuff to try and minimize duplication. So in terms of the actual, if you're using GitHub Actions, how do you debug it? Well, not very easily, unfortunately, but there is a few things that you can do. So one of these is like there are these magic secrets that you can add in the secret UI. So if you add these secrets with these names and set the values to true, then you get verbose logging when the workflow runs. So you get additional output from the individual actions if the authors of those actions have been helpful and added actual debug statements to their code, and then for the actual runner itself. So this can be fairly useful, although there's a lot of information in there that might not be useful. The other thing I've had limited success with is this thing called Act, or this tool called Act, which you can install locally, and effectively it allows you to run your workflows locally. And here on the right, I've got some examples of how you can invoke it. So you can give it an event type, so invoke it with a pull request. You can invoke specific jobs, and then you can also pass in secrets to almost simulate how the workflow would run in the GitHub Actions environment. Like I said, I've had limited success. There are some gaps in its abilities, and ultimately, it's no substitute for running in the actual like GitHub Action environment, but it could help you catch a lot of those issues early. So I would say give it a go. So that's it for the tips. I'd like to talk a bit about the design of workflows themselves. And I'd argue that we should treat workflows and pipelines with the same respect and care and thought as the code we produce, because it's important, because if it goes wrong, it doesn't work, it can stop us actually delivering those features, right? And I just think sometimes we spend so much time and care on the code we produce. Often this side of the project, or delivering the code to production or dev, that can just be not quite an afterthought, but not as much effort is put on it, and that can cause real problems. So the first thing I would say is keep your workflows simple. As you can see in this image or this picture, that is not a simple solution. Like, if you're adding complexity to your workflows, like GitHub Actions is a humbling experience, right? Eliminate complexity where you can and try and not be too clever. It won't save you in the long run, and you'll probably spend far more time debugging it, and that can be really painful. Also, I'd say just try and keep the moving parts to an absolute minimum if you can. Just put in there what is necessary. The other thing I would say is like keep it lean. Don't bake too much into the workflows. Avoid too much scripting being inlined in them. Instead, reference external scripts in your repository or lean on build tools. Let them do the heavy lifting. For example, use the Maven Spring Boot plugin to build your images for you. It just avoids you becoming too coupled to the service, and it will definitely help you with contingency plans, which brings me on to my next point. You need a backup plan. It's not good enough to say GitHub Actions is down. GitHub are only human, mistakes are inevitable, and it's part of the deal when handing off responsibility to a third party. You're accepting some risk. And unfortunately, again, we've seen some issues with GitHub Actions. So what is a backup plan? Well, for me, it's a run book, which is a process that people can find and follow in the event of a GitHub Actions outage. It should detail important things like, if I can't run this workflow, how would I build the image? How would I push this to production? So you need to still get software out even if the tooling is down. And remember, if you've kept it lean and you're not too coupled to the actual workflow, you should have the scripts or the bits and pieces in your repository to actually build this run book. Also, consider having a backup, maybe even print it out. It's massively helpful to avoid issues and awkward conversations when you're talking to key stakeholders in the company and saying, we can't deploy to production today because GitHub is having problems. And suddenly you're having this terrible thought that people are questioning, should we be using GitHub? And that's just not a conversation I really want to have. Yeah. The next thing I'd like to talk about is like thinking about your repository and treating it as an API. Like how you structure your workflows, particularly if you have to do like cross-repository workflow communication. And I'd stress that try and keep this sort of thing to a minimum, but if you need to, thinking your repository as an API is a good place to start, almost like you're designing these pieces of software or these components in your code base, and that they're loosely coupled things. So I'd say don't modify content in another repository, do it via a workflow. So a repository should be responsible for mutating its own state. Sounds a bit similar to some of the design sort of tenets that we take building software, right? So like ask a repository to perform an action, don't do it yourself. And in particular, these two events, the repository dispatch and workflow dispatch, can help you do that. Have that kind of chaining between two repos. I know this is a bit abstract, so what does this look like? So in this diagram, we have two repositories, a service repo where the active development is happening, and then a GitOps repo, which may be a description of the world, in Kubernetes. So it could have things like the application, like manifests, and also some notion of the version that's running. Let's say it's a dev environment. And one of the things we want to do is when we merge PRs to the service repo on the right, we want to build an image, but it'd be great if we could then push that out to a development environment automatically. So what we've got is a couple of workflows, one in the service repo to build the image, but then also invoke a workflow on the GitOps repo, sorry. The bit of information being passed between them is an event or a message that says, here's the version which I would like you to deploy. It's then up to the workflow in the GitOps repo to understand where that version should go, where that new version should go, and what it should do. Having this clean separation is just really helpful, because if you ever need to refactor one of those repositories, then they're not reaching into each other. There's no real shared knowledge there. So the kind of impact of that refactoring is just kept to the GitOps repo. So if you decide to throw out what you're doing, you want to turn everything into Helm charts, for instance. So I just think that's just a really nice way of thinking about things. But in that note, I'd say beware of the coupling. Particularly, I know I've just advocated for it in a way, but it's complicated and finicky. The permissions and the action settings. You need to have these repositories set up in very specific ways to let this happen. It might be good as a stopgap, but it's not very robust. So I would say it's something, if you need to do it, but then try and find a better solution for this. In terms of sharing actions and shared workflows, as I was talking about earlier, I'd say treat that with caution too, because it's a bit like a microservice architecture where you suddenly start getting shared dependencies between services. It can be a drag. So I would say premature optimization is definitely, 2 or 3 is better than 1. So maybe a bit of like duplication here is handy before you start centralizing things. Otherwise, you might find out you've kind of tied yourself up in knots. The next thing I wanted to talk about was security. And it's really important. You can't ignore this. So GitHub Actions has a marketplace. People can publish actions on there, but you've got to be really vigilant when consuming those actions. Those third-party actions, you become only as secure as the maintainers of those actions, right? That's a really important point. GitHub, they publish steps to harden your workflows when consuming things like third-party actions. You really need to follow it. And there's a link at the end of the talk about this. Also, I would just suggest reviewing your repository settings. Like, as the product evolves, they're adding more nuanced ways to control how GitHub Actions is interacting with your repositories. For example, until recently, you couldn't say, or you couldn't have any control over whether GitHub Actions could approve or not approve pull requests, and that's an optional thing. Also, a very important point is don't allow workflows to run from forked PRs, because in that case, people have access to your secrets. And that's an awful thing, especially, depending on what you're doing. If it's an infrastructure repository, maybe there's some AWS credentials in there. They could be a really bad thing. So when I say hardening, one simple thing you can take away from this is, like, when defining or using or consuming an action, you can pin an action to a commit hash. So the difference between the top and the top is a tag, the bottom is a hash, which currently the tag points to. The problem with tags is they can move and they don't have a history. So how would you know if somebody nefarious took control of the create pull request action? At least with using the full hash, you actually know what it's always going to resolve to. Of course, you need to audit these actions as well. It's no good just pinning them to a hash. You need to actually inspect them and understand what is going on before you take that on. There are other methods of dealing with this risk as well, including forking the actions, and then you can control the upstream changes, obviously auditing them and reviewing them before you integrate them in your fork. But yeah, this is a very simple thing you can do, and it could be a starting point. Also, you can limit the permissions of the GitHub token. You can do this, like in the bottom box. It has read and write permissions or read-only permissions. You can do that at a repository level or an organization level. I'd suggest it should be set at read-only. And then what you can do in the workflows is you can actually specify for a particular job or workflow the set of permissions that the job or workflow should run with. And there's various aspects of the GitHub API there you can say. So, for example, I would want it to read contents to be able to check out the repository, and I would like it to write packages because I'm building a Docker image and pushing it to the GitHub container registry, for instance. I would urge you to think about the principle of least privilege here. Only give the job or workflow as much permissions as it needs to do the job. Also, I would ask you to consider using a service account for things that the GitHub token can't do. So particularly when it comes to that cross-repository communication, the GitHub token isn't sufficient for that. You need a personal access token. But that shouldn't be a personal access token owned by yourself. You should have a service account which takes on that responsibility. And if you're looking at service accounts, try and avoid that sort of godlike service account which seems to have control over everything. Maybe think of some more nuanced, several different sub-accounts or something to do different things. And then if you're doing things with interacting with cloud providers, say with AWS, you have an infrastructure type repository, instead of having like static credentials stored in those secrets, look at the OpenID Connect for cloud providers, where you can actually give, where a workflow has an identity, and you can give it certain permissions inside your AWS environment. Really though, security, it's like a whole talk in itself. There's much more to it than what I can go into today. So I'd recommend you looking at this talk here, how to use GitHub Actions with security in mind. If you do a Google search for that, you'll find it. I saw it presented at GitHub Universe 2021, and it was a real refreshing and honest look at actions. But I've got a surprise takeaway for you all, or call to action. You need to take this stuff seriously. Supply chain attacks are a growing problem, and if nobody in your team is looking at them, then this is an action on you. So congratulations. People will see this talk, know you are here. And that's really it. With GitHub Actions, understand there will be pain. Don't sweat the small stuff, and don't ignore the security. And then you will too find unexpected delights in GitHub Actions. Cool. If anybody's interested, there are some references online, and I think we've got some minutes left, so what I can do is actually jump into a quick demo, which was unplanned, so 1 second. Just to illustrate, where's that screen? Oh, this is not going to work. 1 second. Right. I'm just going to mirror my screens because otherwise I will not be able to control it. So going back to that example where I was talking about the service repository and the infrastructure repository. So I have in my GitHub account, and this is all shared and public, I have a service repository. So this is like a Spring, well, it's not a Spring Boot service, but it's like a Spring Boot service being built and packaged up. I have a pull request ready on this repo. If it loads, oh no, maybe the internet's not good enough. Yeah, maybe I'll just abandon this. This is what I feared. Anyway, sorry about that. But anyway, all the resources are online, publicly available. You can look at the simple workflow I talked about, the service repository and the GitOps repository. Most of it it's using the best practices. There's some custom actions in there, composite actions, some of the security hardening guidelines are being followed. And then there's some links to Ogmios. Please check out his videos. He's also got a BBC Three series. But yes, that's it. And thank you for listening. And who doesn't like a QR code? Thanks to the pandemic. There we go. So that links to my GitHub as well. So if you need more information, please go there. So great. Thank you very much.